You're listening to a mini episode of the Practical Permaculture Podcast with Joe and Elise. Welcome back to our next instalment of our homesteading mini-series. Today we're talking about sourdough. Now, sourdough's been around since 1500 BC, so just a little while, and it's known in most places around the world. And sourdough remains a staple in most people's diets and in cafes and menus worldwide. So the reason being is because it's bloody delicious, right? Like, I don't know anyone that doesn't like sourdough. Well, what is it? So sourdough is a naturally leavened, I keep wanting to say leavened, but it's a naturally leavened bread, meaning that it requires essentially no commercial yeast for it to rise. What makes the sourdough unique from, say, its supermarket counterparts is that it uses a sourdough starter, and that's a mixture of fermented flour and water that contains wild yeast and good bacteria. And that's the thing that causes it to rise. So it doesn't contain any additives like milk or oils or sweeteners or anything like that. And because of the lack of additives, and paired naturally with, its naturally occurring acids and the fermentation process, it actually makes it a healthier alternative to most other supermarket or commercially produced breads. And most people can tolerate it a lot better. So as we said, it's made from flour and water. It also has a little bit of salt in there. And I suppose the flour. So let's start with the flour, the type of flour that you need. So it can be really made using any type of bread flour, but I recommend using a high protein bread flour. You are going to get a better result. Most so commercially available bread flours are a higher protein, but you can still check to see what the protein content is. Now, water. Tap water is fine if you're on tank. I wouldn't necessarily worry too much about it if it was chlorinated. However, what I would recommend is maybe leaving it sit out for 24 hours or using cooled boiled water. That way you're just sort of allowing a little bit of that, the chemicals to be able to I don't know what you call it, off-gas release, into the atmosphere. So try and avoid using tap water if you're on mains. And salt. Now, any type of cooking salt is fine, but pure sea salt is great if you can get your hands on it. And the starter, of course, which is 2 of the 3 ingredients that has been pre-fermented. Now, sourdough starter. Or a sourdough culture if you prefer. Essentially, it is a fermented dough filled with natural wild yeast and bacteria called lactobacilli. And the starter, as I mentioned before, is what helps the bread to rise. So think of your sourdough starter as a living thing because it is literally full of life and it requires nurturing just like any other living being. There are apparently over 50 million yeasts and over 5 million lactobacilli bacteria in every teaspoon of starter dough. And look, that's the thing that really gives it its signature sour flavour, hence the sourdough. So I'm not going to go through how to make a starter because there are tons of videos out there. And they show you from start to finish how to make a starter. I will say that it is very simple, but it takes time and there is a very particular process that you need to follow. It's much easier if you've got a friend who is a baker and they use they bake sourdough, they've got a starter, hit them up for some of their discarded starter because at some stage there is going to be discard and then you can use that and you can build on that, and it's also going to give you a much more robust and flavoursome starter than a very early, very young sort of starter. And now, depending how often that you bake will depend on if you keep it in the fridge or if you keep it on the bench. So daily or every other day baking, and that would require daily feeding of your starter, and I would keep that on the bench. But the rest of the time, if you're only baking maybe once or twice a week or less than that, then I definitely recommend keeping your starter in the fridge because if you miss a day of feeding, then, you do risk, depending on what the temperature's like, you do risk your starter going a bit funky and a bit off, and you don't want to lose that. But also, there's a lot of wastage if you're not baking all the time with it, if you've got it on the bench and you're feeding it every day because you've got nothing to use all that excess starter for. Now, a note on this, because I didn't understand this when I first started it with sourdough, is that if you get like this purpley dark sort of liquid that sits on top, so it sort of separates out of the solids of the starter, that's actually called hooch. And it's all part of the fermentation process. So what you want to do is just stir it back in. You don't want to lose this. Don't pour it off. I almost made that mistake the first time, and then I went, I'm just going to just do a bit of research and check. And then I realized that is actually all the good stuff. So you don't want to lose your hooch. But if it's looking moldy, or if it's funky or stinky, it's starting to look like a bit of a science experiment, ditch it and start again. Look, your nose will know. If in doubt, get rid of it and start again. The last thing you want to do is make yourself or someone else ill because you went, it should be okay. Now, I feed my starter a 50-50 by weight. So say if I'm doing 70 grams of flour, then I'm doing 70 grams of water. Always by weight. Never do it by measurement, okay? Because you're going to get a very different result. Always bake by weight. That's just a general rule for baking, full stop. I use an organic bread flour that I've sourced somewhat locally from here, from a property nearby that grows and mills their own flour. However, you can use any sort of high protein bread flour. Now, look, baking is fun, but let's be honest, sourdough baking when you first start out is fucking infuriating. You will fail lots, but don't give up. Please don't give up. I gave up the first few times and I just went, screw it, I can't do this. I'm just not a sourdough baker. But then I realized that there are other ways to do it. There's heaps of factors that can affect the success of a loaf. And that can be the recipe, it can be the humidity, it can be the flour that you're using, it can be the readiness and the robustness of the starter, so the timing that you are using your starter after you've fed it. It can be the hydration of the starter, meaning the amount of water versus the amount of flour. It can be the temperature, and it can also be the method. I have found the humidity to be a real kick in the ass. So if it's super humid, you will find that it's going to mess with your dough. So you want to be basically proving that in a really dry area and not necessarily just out on the bench. So maybe you can prove it in the oven if you're going to be cooking in a cold oven anyway. So take some time to watch the videos because as I mentioned, there's lots of different methods with lots of different recipes. Look, some methods, they have you folding the dough every hour or two, and some are really minimal hands-on. Some are higher hydration and some are a drier sort of dough mix. So I always ended up with this soggy mess, right? So I was obviously using a higher hydration and I could just never get the bloody thing to work. So I've actually found Ben Starr. He's on YouTube. He's a baker on YouTube and he's got a method for lazy people. It is literally 10 minutes hands-on. It is a recipe that is a really dry mix. So you're not going to end up, it still sticks to your hands, but it's not going to end up with this just big soggy mess that isn't going to comply. And it has much, much, much more forgiveness for a learner baker. And look, I still use it. I find that the rise of this particular recipe and the air bubbles are often less, but the compromise for me is perfectly fine. I'll put the link in the show notes so you can check out his video. And look, there are when we talk about equipment, there's loads of things that you can buy, but the only things that you actually need to get started are a bowl for mixing, and for proving, a very sharp knife for scoring, a cloth for over the bowl, and a Dutch oven or some similar vessel, as you'll need to bake it with the lid on. So essentially you're going to steam your loaf and then you'll take the lid off to brown it off. That's it. That's all you need to get started. And of course, your sourdough starter. So you can go nuts with all sorts of things like bannetons, like they're the proving baskets that give it a nice, the nice pretty pattern on top. A lamb for scoring, which is essentially a blade on the end of a doohickey, and you use that. You can use a really sharp knife instead of that, or even scissors. I've used scissors in a pinch as well, where I've just snipped the top. Scrapers, you don't necessarily need them. Get them if you want, but you don't need them. I would suggest waiting until you've gotten into the feel of actually baking a sourdough to work out the items that you're going to think that you need to make your life easier. I've got some things here that I just don't use anymore because it just doesn't factor into my baking regime, I suppose you could say. So do your research, watch an absolute bake load of sourdough videos and how-tos, and try lots of different recipes too, because depending on where you live, what you have access to, what the temperature is, the season, all of those things that we mentioned, it's going to play into the success of your loaf. So find us on the Practical Permaculture Community Facebook group or on Instagram, and share with us, please share with us your success and also your failures. If you have any questions that I can answer, or I can at least point you in the right direction, because I'm still very new at baking sourdough as well. So I look forward to seeing all your successes, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Practical Permaculture podcast. Jump onto our Facebook group to keep the chat going and to look for any resources that we mentioned on today's show. Look in the show notes.
And if you enjoyed today's episode, then please give us a like, a review, and share with your friends. And if you didn't, then that's okay. We're sure you'll find the right podcast for you.